Grandparents always told her, money is a tool, not a trophy. She didn't fully understand those words until they were gone. After their sudden death, Ava inherited $18 million, and with it, a painful lesson about human nature. The people who should have protected her tried to pressure her, shame her, and take control of what was never meant for them. But Ava's grandparents had chosen her for a reason. They didn't trust her because she loved money. They trusted her because she didn't. And as her family's greed exploded, Ava had to decide what kind of legacy she would protect.
My name is Leslie. I'm 27. Just a month ago, I was a barista scraping by in a small studio. My grandparents basically raised me, not my parents. They were wealthy but lived simply, teaching me integrity was more valuable than money. After they died in a sudden, awful accident, my world shattered. Then, at their lawyer's offices, I learned they left me everything, their entire $20 million estate. Immediately, family who never called them suddenly wanted a piece. But I refused to let that happen. If you want to see how an inheritance exposes people's true colors, stick around and let me know where you're watching from. In the comments, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories on how family greed can turn ugly. Growing up, my parents were technically around, but that's about it. My father, Mark, was a workaholic, always chasing the next promotion, working 60-hour weeks. My mother, Claire, was more invested in her social life and charity functions. We rarely ate dinner as a family, and when we did, they were glued to their phones for work or event planning. They gave me a house and food, but not much more. From the time I was 5, I spent every weekend and summer with my grandparents, Arthur and Rose. Their simple 3-bedroom house was my sanctuary. Despite being millionaires, their life was modest. On their few acres, Grandpa Arthur taught me to grow tomatoes and corn in his vegetable garden. Grandma Rose showed me how to bake bread from scratch and patch my own clothes. They came to every school play and awards ceremony my parents always seemed to forget. My grandparents built their fortune from absolutely nothing. They started a small tool company in their garage in the 70s with a single machine and a lot of hard work. By the time I was born, Sterling Tools was a regional success with 2 large factories. But you would never know their net worth just by looking at them. My grandpa drove the same old Chevy pickup for 20 years. My grandma used coupons at the grocery store and only bought clothes on sale. They always told me, money is a tool, Lily, not a trophy. Use it to build a good life, not to impress people you don't even like. That mentality created a huge rift between them and my father. As their only child, he just assumed he'd inherit everything and live like a king. He despised their simple lifestyle, calling them cheap and old-fashioned. What he called deprivation, they called character. They paid for his college, but they still insisted he get a summer job. After he graduated, they gave him a down payment on a small starter house, not the fancy downtown condo he demanded. The final straw came when my father demanded to be made a vice president at their company, despite having 0 experience. My grandparents said no, telling him he had to earn it like everyone else. He quit in a fit of rage, took a job in finance, and their relationship was broken for good. With me, they were the complete opposite. They paid for all my schooling, so I graduated completely debt-free. They simply encouraged me to find work I was passionate about, not a job that was just for the paycheck. So when I decided to become a barista, they were honestly proud of me, even though my starting salary was barely enough to get by on. Throughout my 20s, I was incredibly close to my grandparents. We had dinner together every single Sunday without fail. I was their personal tech support, setting up their new tablets and showing them how to video call. They taught me all their old family recipes and told me stories from when they were young. On holidays, I always chose to be with them instead of my parents, which caused huge arguments with my mother. She saw it as a personal betrayal. I lived in a 1-bedroom apartment about a 30-minute drive from my grandparents' house. It was small, but it was all mine, filled with thrift store furniture and way too many plants. My salary from the coffee shop wasn't much, but I made it work. I found joy in simple things, like getting books from the library, hiking the state park trails, and volunteering at the local animal shelter. My grandparents respected my independence, though they'd sometimes give me practical gifts, like a new set of snow tires or a nice espresso machine. A month ago, my whole world came crashing down. I was home on a Tuesday night when the phone rang. It was the highway patrol. My grandparents were driving home when a drunk driver, a red light, hitting their car. They were killed on impact. The officer said they didn't suffer, but that was little comfort. The funeral was a complete blur. I remember my parents taking over the arrangements, bickering with the director about every single cost. My brother Sam flew in from out of town, but was on his phone the entire time. My Aunt Sophia put on an award-winning performance, sobbing when people were looking, but her tears vanished the second they turned away. Uncle Ben just stood in the back, her quiet shadow. None of them had bothered to visit my grandparents in years. But there they were, playing the part of the grieving, devoted family. I just felt numb. The only two people who had ever truly loved me were gone. Their home, once so full of laughter and warmth, just felt cold and empty. Couldn't bring myself to go inside after the funeral. I went back to my apartment, took a leave of absence from my job, and just tried to deal with the shock. 2 weeks after the service, I got a call from Mr. Gable, my grandparents' attorney. He said I needed to come to his office with my parents, aunt, and uncle for the official reading of the will. I had no idea that meetings was about to reveal who my family really was. The morning of the reading, it was cold and drizzling, which perfectly matched my mood. I got to the office 15 minutes early in a simple black dress, carrying an umbrella my grandma made me keep in the car. The office was in a gorgeous old brownstone that had been converted, full of the dark wood paneling and leather armchairs. Mr. Gable met me with a kind, firm handshake. He was in his late 60s, with gentle eyes and graying hair. My grandparents always said he was more than a lawyer. He was a trusted friend they had known for 30 years.
I am so deeply sorry for your loss,
Lily, he said softly. Arthur and Rose were truly wonderful people. I'll miss our chess games and her famous pecan pie during our meetings. His sincere words made my eyes sting with tears. Thank you, I managed to say. They always spoke so highly of you. At that moment, the heavy front door flew open and my family swept in like a storm. My father Mark strode in first, scowling at his expensive watch. At 56, he looked like a colder, harsher version of my grandpa, completely missing his warmth. My mother Claire glided in behind him with a designer purse that likely cost more than my entire car. My 25-year-old brother Sam followed, wearing sunglasses indoors like some celebrity. His idea of dressing up was a wrinkled polo shirt, messily tucked into his pants. Aunt Sophia, my dad's sister, trailed them, already complaining loudly into her phone about a problem at her tennis club. Uncle Ben snuck in last. He gave me a quick, nervous nod before staring at the floor. They'd been married for 2 decades, but I doubt I'd heard him say more than a dozen words. All right, let's get this show on the road, my father boomed, not even bothering to say hello. Some of us have to run actual companies, mister. Gable forced a strained smile. Of course, Mark. If everyone would please come with me to the conference room. The air in that room was thick with greed as we all sat around a giant polished table. My father immediately took the chair at the head of the table as if he were king. I sat near Mr. Gable, as far from my father as possible. Everyone else fell into their typical roles. My mother sat at my father's right hand with Sam beside her, and Aunt Sophia and Uncle Ben sat directly across from them. Before we begin, Mr. Gable started, I want to state for the record that Arthur and Rose were both of sound mind when they last updated this will 1 year ago. They were incredibly specific and very clear about all of their wishes. My father just scoffed. Just get to it, Gable. We all know how this works. My father built that company. I'm his son. It's a formality, mister. Gable ignored him and opened a thick leather-bound folder. He put on his reading glasses and began. I, Arthur Sterling, and I, Rose Sterling, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be our last will and testament. The dry legal jargon droned on for several minutes as Mr. Gable read through the standard clauses and appointments. My family was practically buzzing with greedy anticipation. At last, he got to the part they were all there to hear. We hereby leave our entire estate, including but not limited to all cash accounts totaling around $6 million. Our investment portfolio, valued at $10 million. All real estate holdings, including our primary home, valued at $3 million, and our remaining ownership in Sterling Tools, worth an estimated $1 million to our cherished granddaughter, Lily Ann Scott. The entire room went completely silent. My heart just slammed against my ribs. This had to be a nightmare. Leo S., lawyer, cleared his throat. The agreement transfers $75 million in pre-IPO shares to a new trust for his child with Sloan Vance. This action nullifies all prior arrangements concerning the marital estate with my wife, Ava, or our unborn child. My financial contributions during the marriage were, quote, more than generous as a fact our legal team is prepared to defend. Leo's father, Harrison, shot to his feet, nearly sending his crystal tumbler flying. Show me that document, he snarled, snatching the tablet from the lawyer to read the terms himself. This is a betrayal, his wife Eleanor whispered, her voice like ice. $75 million to that venture capital shark? She'll gut the company's value. My brother-in-law, Griffin, slammed his glass of scotch on the marble coffee table. What about my seed funding? I was next in line for that capital I need for my NFT marketplace. His wife Tinsley shot me a look of pure venom. What did you do, Ava? How could you let this happen? I was just frozen, hollowed out, as their words echoed in the sterile, minimalist living room. $75 million. My husband wasn't just leaving me, he was giving away our future. The lawyer calmly retrieved the tablet from Harrison. If we can all try to remain composed, there is one more thing. Leo is joining us via video call from Tokyo to explain. He tapped the screen and a massive monitor hidden behind a modern art piece flickered on. Leo appeared, sitting in a conference room, the glittering Tokyo skyline behind him. My stomach twisted seeing him there, looking exactly like he did this morning before he left for that emergency board meeting. His digital image started talking. If you're re-seeing this, it means the paperwork has been filed. I wanted to explain this as myself. To prevent any confusion, he stared through the camera, as if looking right into my soul. Ava, I still care about you, but we want different things now. For years, Leo's voice filled the silent room. I've watched you pouring your energy into your documentary projects while Nexus AI was redefining the future. You've treated my life as work like a vanity fund for your art, not an empire we were supposed to build together, he then listed every investor dinner I'd missed, every tech conference I'd avoided, painting my anxiety as total indifference. The company I built, Leo said, his voice flat, was never about having a comfortable life. It's about making an impact, about shaping what comes next. It demanded total focus and sacrifice. He paused for a beat. Sloan is the only person who truly gets that kind of drive. She pushes me. She understands the cost of building something truly great. She's not satisfied with some quiet little life, he continued. She's in Singapore one day and Zurich the next, closing 9-figure deals. Her whole career is about taking a billion-dollar company and turning it into a $10 billion one. I trust Sloan to be a partner in this empire. She will use these resources to grow our vision, not just live off of them. The video call lasted several more minutes as Leo detailed his grand vision with Sloan New Global Markets, a joint tech incubator, their entire lives mapped out like a business plan. When he finally signed off, Harrison was shaking with rage. This is absolute insanity. She's gotten into his head. It's painfully obvious. We will fight this settlement with every dollar we have. Leo's lawyer, who had been waiting silently, finally spoke up. He anticipated this reaction, Harrison. Leo underwent a full mental competency review before filing, with 2 independent psychiatrists confirming he is of sound mind. He has also kept detailed emails for the last 5 years, noting the growing gap between his and Ava's life goals. I have to advise you that challenging this divorce will be incredibly costly, prolonged, and will absolutely destroy the company's reputation before the IPO. Eleanor turned to me, her voice dripping with manufactured concern. Ava, darling, you know he can really mean this. It's just a moment of weakness. Those shares belong in the family's main holding company to protect our legacy. You will sign them over to us, won't you? For the good of the family. The room felt like it was shrinking. All of them were just staring, waiting. I need a moment to process this, I finally managed to say. I had no idea.
Process what?
Griffin scoffed. Those shares need to be managed by someone who understands venture capital, he said, jabbing a thumb at his own chest. As they began to argue, the lawyer quietly touched my arm. You don't need to decide anything right now, Ava. Take all the time you need. He handed me a sleek, titanium briefcase. This contains the full settlement details, the keys to a secure condo in Pacific Heights, and the contact info for your own team of legal and financial advisors. Please, call me if you need anything. The room descended into chaos, filled with threats of lawsuits and bitter accusations. Eventually, the lawyer had to raise his voice and declare the meeting over. As we were all leaving, Harrison grabbed my arm. This is not over, he seethed. You will be at our home for dinner tonight. 7 o'clock sharp. Do not be late. It was a command, not a request. I just nodded, too numb to fight. As they all climbed into their identical black G-Wagons, I sat in my practical, safe Volvo in the guest parking lot, clutching the briefcase. A life I thought we were building together had just been turned into a weapon to be used against me. I spent the afternoon driving in a haze through the winding roads of the Marin Headlands, finally pulling over with a view of the ocean just to breathe. The briefcase sat on the passenger seat like an unexploded bomb I was too afraid to touch. Part of me had to know the price he put on our life together. The other part was terrified of the war that was about to begin. At 7 on the dot, I drove through the gates of my in-laws' Atherton estate and saw the other SUVs were already there. Their ultra-modern compound rose up before me, a fortress of glass, steel, and stark white concrete designed to intimidate, not welcome. I took one shaky breath, grabbed the briefcase, and walked inside. They were all waiting in the soaring living space, a room so perfectly designed, it felt more like an art gallery than a home. Harrison stood by a huge modern fireplace, swirling a single malt scotch. Eleanor was perched on a pristine white sofa. Griffin was pacing and barking into his phone, while his wife Tinsley just stared at the polished concrete floors. Finally, Harris noticed me. Ava, Yuri here. I sat in the chair farthest from them, making sure I had a clear path to the door. Let us approach this logically, he began, in the same voice he used for corporate acquisitions. Leo is clearly not thinking straight. His first priority should have been protecting this family's assets, not giving them away. Eleanor nodded in agreement. Darling, a sum like this is a huge responsibility. Yuri pregnant, Yuri emotional. Harrison is the only one qualified to manage these shares. You'll be looked after, of course. We can set you up in a lovely condo in a nice area, something more manageable for you. The condescension was a deliberate jab, but I wouldn't give them the satisfaction. My silence seemed to give him confidence. So this is our proposal. You will sign the entirety of the settlement into a trust, which I, as the patriarch of this family, will manage. This secures everyone's future. You will receive an annual stipend of 3%, which is more than enough for your simple needs. 3%. My voice was a whisper. That is still $2.25 million a year. Exactly, Griffin snapped finally off his call. More than enough for someone who makes films about trees. I need at least 10 million for my new NFT art platform. It's a guaranteed win. I just stared. Griffin had already burned through millions on other guaranteed wins, including a blockchain-based social media app that collapsed in 6 months. And the condo overlooking the bay should really be ours, Tinsley added, finally looking up. We have 2 children, and they need to be in the right schools and social networks. I almost laughed. Tinsley never came to our condo without complaining about the fog. Her children, my own niece and nephew, were like strangers to me who sent stiff, formal holiday photos once a year. As this evening dragged on, their tactics shifted. When the cold business approach failed, they turned to emotional manipulation. After everything we have done for you, Eleanor began, her eyes actually starting to tear up. We brought you into this family, gave you a life you never could have imagined. Is this your idea of gratitude? I felt a wave of nausea. Gratitude? Not one of them had ever asked a single question about my work, my films, or my life. Then Harrison's voice turned to steel. We are not asking you, Ava. We are telling you what will happen. Either you sign the paperwork tonight on your own terms, or we will challenge the prenuptial agreement. We will expose every private detail of your marriage in a public court. How many of Leo's networking events did you refuse to go to? What did you tell your friends about our family? I assure you, this will get very, very unpleasant for you. The threat just hung there in the still air. I felt my head spin for a second, but then something inside me hardened. I remembered what my own father told me. When a corporation tried to strong-arm him into selling our family's vineyard, never let a rich man's temper make you feel small, Ava, he said. You just know your own worth, and you hold your ground. My Uncle Leo, silent all evening, finally cleared his throat. David, don't you think we should give Chloe a moment to breathe? My father shot him a look that could freeze fire. This is business, Leo. She's family, he replied softly, but fell silent under my father's stare. By 9, my brother Mark was on his tablet, drafting asset liquidation plans. My mother was on the phone with their financial advisor, discussing tax implications. My aunt was already scrolling through luxury property listings, chattering about renovation potential. They were divvying up my future right in front of me. No one ever brought up what my grandparents would have wanted. They never once asked what my plans were for their legacy. At 10:30, my dad slid a thick contract and a pen across the polished dining table. Sign it, he ordered. I scanned the pages. It was full of slick legal jargon, but the meaning was clear. He'd get total power of attorney. In exchange, I'd receive a stipend, which he alone would control. I set the document down and took a steadying breath. The room fell dead silent. What was that? My dad asked, his voice slow and threatening. I looked him in the eye. No, I am not signing that. My grandparents put their faith in me, and I wasn't about to betray them. My mom erupted, yelling about how I was throwing everything away. My brother Mark muttered something vile under his breath. My aunt started sobbing about her own kids' financial security. Through it all, I sat there, rigid, letting that one word no be my armor. Finally, my dad slammed his fist on the table. Enough, he bellowed. I told your grandfather you were too sentimental. You played him, and now you're playing us with this pathetic little act. He leaned across the table, his finger jabbing the air toward me. You have a choice to make, Chloe. Right now. You either sign that paper and you are one of us, or you walk out that door with your inheritance and you are nothing to us. You can't have both. The threat was so absolute. I looked from face to face, searching for a single shred of warmth, of actual love. I saw nothing but greed. And in that moment, I got it. I was never part of the family. I was just the gatekeeper to their payday. I'm not sinning, I said, my voice shaking but clear as I finally stood up. I'm sorry you feel this way, but I have to honor what Grandma and Grandpa wanted. Then get out of my house, my father spat. Pack a bag. Be gone by midnight. I have my own loft, I told him, trying to sound calm. I haven't lived here in 5 years. He let out a laugh that had no humor in it. The loft we co-signed for because your art curation job barely pays rent. Check the ownership records, sweetheart. One of my holding companies bought that building last year. Your lease is terminated. My blood ran cold. He was right. I couldn't get the place alone, so they had helped. I didn't know they owned the building. You have 30 minutes, my mom said, checking a thin gold watch on her wrist. We're changing the locks in the morning. I stood there, paralyzed. They were actually going to make me homeless over money they had no right to. Time's ticking, Mark smirked from the doorway. Hurry up. All those millions won't buy you a bed for the night. Throwing my life in 2 suitcases felt like an out-of-body experience. I was on autopilot, just grabbing things. How could wealth twist people into such unrecognizable monsters? My dad stood in the doorway of my old room, arms folded, watching me like a hawk. As I packed, I could hear my mother downstairs on a call with a realtor already scheduling an appraisal for my grandparents' estate. You were never really one of us, my dad said, his voice completely devoid of emotion. Your mother and I were splitting up. Then we learned she was pregnant with you. You're the only reason this marriage ever lasted. The words were delivered so casually, so cruelly. It felt like he'd physically struck me. I always felt like an outsider, but to hear him confirm it, then my mother was there. We've wasted enough money on you, she said. That semester abroad, the private college, all those art supplies. Consider our investment a total write-off, she added. An investment, not a daughter, just a failed business venture. Mark leaned against the door, a smug look on his face. You'll regret this when you're all alone, he said. That money won't last forever. And when you come crawling back, don't forget you chose it over us. I pulled the zipper on my last bag, fighting back tears. I refused to give them the satisfaction. Is that all? My dad demanded. I glanced around my childhood room. I only stayed here for holidays, but this was still space. My debate trophies, my diploma, photo albums, my books, my entire life story was on these shelves. I can get the rest later, I mumbled. My father gave a short, harsh laugh. There is no later. What you leave here tonight is in a dumpster tomorrow. Your call. The sheer spite was stunning. They were literally throwing my entire past away, all because I wouldn't hand over a fortune they hadn't earned. I grabbed my grandpa's old cashmere blanket from the bed and stuffed it in my bag. I wasn't leaving that behind. Then, with the bag straining my shoulders, I walked downstairs. No one offered to help. At the front door, I risked one last look back. They stood in the foyer like a panel of judges, their faces masks of fury and smug victory. You have the money, my mom said, but someday you'll realize family is worth more. You'll regret this. I'm not the one throwing family away, I said, my voice just a whisper. You are. And I walked out the door into the cold night. As it clicked shut behind me, everything hit me at once. I had no home. My family had cast me out. In a single night, I'd become a millionaire. And completely alone. Sitting in my car, the floodgates opened. Tears poured down my face in great ragged sobs that shook my entire frame. I cried for my grandparents, for their warmth and love that was now just a memory. I cried for the family that what I had, the illusion that had just shattered. And I cried for myself because I was now profoundly and terrifyingly alone in the world. After what felt like an eternity, I finally wiped my eyes and turned the key in the ignition. But where could I possibly go? I couldn't face a hotel check-in like this, and I couldn't call a friend to explain this unbelievable horror story. Then I remembered the Manila envelope this estate lawyer had given me. Inside was a single key on a small silver compass keychain my grandpa always carried. It was the key to my grandparents' house, a house that I realized now belonged to me. The drive across the city felt completely unreal. Every block was a mix of intense relief and gut-wrenching grief I was going home. but home would be empty. I hadn't been back since the service. It was too hard. The porch light was on, set on a timer. I sat in my car for a moment, then finally grabbed my bags and walked to the door, the key shaking in my hand. The house smelled exactly how I remembered, like Grandma's lavender sachets and the bees polish Grandpa used on the furniture. I flipped on the lights, half expecting to hear their voices call out a welcome. But the silence was total and deafening. I went straight to the guest room, which had always been my room, and dropped my suitcases. It was perfectly preserved. The novel I was reading sat on the nightstand, my bookmark holding my place. My grandma had left a fresh set of linens on the armchair for me, ready for my next visit. That simple act of love, that anticipation for a visit that could never be, just broke me all over again. I fell onto the bed and cried myself to sleep, fully dressed. When I woke, sunlight was pouring through the window. For a split second, I thought I smelled bacon cooking and heard my grandpa humming in the kitchen. Then the quiet returned and last night's reality came crashing down. They were gone. And I had inherited not just their estate, but also their problems, my own family. My phone had been buzzing nonstop. The messages from my parents were a sickening mix of threats and fake concern. "We can work this out, Chloe, if you'll just listen to reason." My dad's text was blunt. "You have 24 hours before we file to contest the will." Mark's was vicious. "Enjoy the big empty house. You won't be there long." That one sent a shiver of real fear through me. I forwarded it to my lawyer, Matthew, who replied in seconds. "Stay put. Lock the doors. I'll be there in 30 minutes. Don't let anyone in." His urgency was terrifying but also a relief. Someone was in my corner. He arrived right on time, holding a briefcase and 2 coffees. I led him into the kitchen. "Okay, first things first," he said, pushing a coffee toward me. "Your family has already been in touch with 3 different litigation firms to challenge the will. I expected this, and I'm prepared." I told him about the eviction, how my dad's company owned my building. Matthew just nodded, his expression grim. "That's David for you." But what he doesn't is that your grandparents were always 10 steps ahead of him. He pulled a thick folder from his briefcase. "They saw this coming." He handed me the deed to a small cabin up on the coast. "Your grandmother bought this 6 years ago and placed it in an irrevocable trust, just for you. Arthur has no idea it exists. You have a safe place to go." A wave of relief washed over me. At least I wouldn't be homeless. But hiding out while my family circled like vultures felt so wrong. "There's a more, mister," Davenport continued. "You are not fighting this battle alone. Your grandparents had many loyal friends who knew exactly what your family was capable of. Just then, a quiet knock came from the guest house door. "Mister," Davenport smiled. "That would be George." George. The name was familiar. George Miller, Mr. Davenport explained. "He was your grandparents' head groundskeeper for the last 20 years. He takes care of the guest house." The door opened to a man in his late 50s with kind eyes and graying hair, twisting a cap in his hands. "Miss Chloe," he said softly, "I'm so sorry for your loss. Your grandparents were wonderful people. I saw your car and just wanted to check if you were okay." His simple kindness nearly made me cry again. "Thank you, George. Honestly, this is all just a bit much." George nodded. "Miss and Mrs. Sterling knew it would be. They asked me to keep an eye on things for you. The house and grounds are all secure. I've been watching over everything, Mr." Davenport waved George over to join us. For the next hour, George shared stories I'd never heard about my grandparents, painting a picture of 2 people who were deeply respected by their entire staff. "Your father and brother," George said, choosing his words with care. "They showed up right after the funeral while the house was empty. They took things: rare watches, first edition books, some new tech. I have it all on the security footage." My blood went cold. My own father had installed a massive security system for them years ago, supposedly for their safety. I completely forgot about those cameras. George just shook his head. They didn't know, mister. Sterling had me install a new system last year. He didn't trust the one your father put in. Said it had too many blind spots. Mister, Davenport made a note of that. That footage is pure gold if they try to sue. There is more, George added. Mrs. Sterling kept journals. She wrote everything down, especially what happened during family visits. There in the study. I followed him to the study, where shelves were lined with dated, leather-bound journals. George pulled a volume from the shelf and handed it to me. This one is from last spring, when your father asked for money, he said, for that new tech startup. I opened it and saw my grandmother's elegant handwriting. May 15th. Arthur visited today the first time in 6 months. He didn't ask about our health. He went right into a pitch for a new venture that needed $250,000. When Alistair refused, Arthur got ugly, accusing us of favoring Chloe. He claimed we were fools to trust her, that she only visited to secure her inheritance. He couldn't be more wrong. Chloe never asks for anything. She has no idea of our actual net worth. She brings us flowers from the garden every Sunday and just stays to read with us. Arthur stormed out before his tea was even cold, leaving Alistair deeply upset. I kept reading, page after page, year after year. It was always the same story. My father demanding capital. My brother Leo, with some ridiculous get-rich-quick scheme. My mother complaining their grand home was a social embarrassment. But my visits? They were described with such love. My grandmother wrote about our book discussions, our long chats, and the little tech issues I solved for them. She saw a part of me my own parents always chose to ignore. While I was reading, the doorbell rang. George answered it, returning with an older woman in a crisp floral dress. This is Mrs. Gable, he said. She was your grandparents' housekeeper for over 20 years. Mrs. Gable pulled me into a fierce hug. You look just like Eleanor when she was your age, she said, her eyes shining with pride. Over the next few hours, more people arrived. Finch, my grandparents' chief accountant for their firm, offered to review all the financials with Mimi. Mr. Hayes, their financial planner, brought binders detailing my entire trust fund. Susan Miller, their neighbor of 30 years, arrived with a casseroles and stories of neighborhood parties I attended as a child. Every single one of them brought not just crucial information, but real affection. They all adored my grandparents, and because of that, they were now here to protect me. While helping me in my grandmother's office, Mrs. Gable found a hidden safe. Inside were letters from my father, stretching back for decades. Every single one was a request for money. This even threatened to keep me away from them if they didn't pay. She also found a flash drive with security footage from the day of the funeral. Your mother went through Eleanor's jewelry box before the service was even over. She pocketed several family heirlooms, claiming Eleanor would have wanted her to have them. It was obvious my grandparents had been preparing for this war for years. They hadn't just left me their money. They left me an army and all the ammunition I could ever possibly need. Around 4, while Mr. Davenport explained a legal document, my phone buzzed. It was a text from my brother Leo. Enjoy the mansion while you can. Mom, Dad, and the others are coming at 10 a.m. tomorrow to claim what's rightfully ours. Stay out of our way or this gets ugly. I showed the screen to Mr. Davenport. His jaw tightened. That is a direct threat, and it implies they intend to force their way inside, he said grimly. I think it's time we put the final stage of your grandparents' plan into motion. He made 2 quick phone calls, speaking in hushed tones about evidence and protocols. When he hung up, he looked directly at me, his eyes serious. They knew this day would come, Chloe. They knew Arthur and the others would never accept the will, so they prepared for this fight. Tomorrow morning, we will be ready for them. But tonight, I want you to see all of this so you know exactly what you're fighting for. He gestured to the dining room table, now covered with journals, bank statements, and legal files. Your grandparents built something far more valuable than wealth. They built a community founded on loyalty and respect. That is their true legacy to you. After everyone but George had left for the night, promising to be back in the morning, a strange calm fell over me. I finally understood that I wasn't facing this alone. My grandparents had passed down not just their estate, but their wisdom and their entire network of allies. I spent that night reading through journals and financial records, seeing my grandparents in a completely new light. They were brilliant, strategic, and always one step ahead. Every decision they made was to protect what they had built and to protect me. For the first time since the will reading, I felt I could actually bear the weight of what they did left me. I refused to fail them now. As I got ready for bed, another text from my brother Leo lit up the screen. Better sleep with one eye open. Tomorrow you'll learn what happens when you cross this family. Instead of fear, a cold, hard sense of purpose washed over me. Oh, tomorrow would definitely show the consequences of crossing family, just not in the way Leo thought. I woke up early, anxious but utterly determined. By 8 a.m., our lawyer, Mr. Davenport, arrived with coffee, pastries, and a thick legal binder. These are restraining orders, all ready to be filed if necessary, he said, and cease and desist letters to address Leo's threats directly. Their private chef, Vincent, came in right after, heading straight to the kitchen. The warm smell of coffee and croissants soon filled the house, a bizarre sense of peace before the impending storm. By 9:30, the house was full of allies. Vincent stood near the front door, a quiet, solid presence. Mrs. Finch, the accountant, had her laptop open on the dining table, ready to project financial records. Vincent made sure we all had fresh coffee. His calm energy was a testament to my grandparents' judgment. At 9:45, headlights swept across the lawn as cars pulled into the long driveway. First, my father's sleek black luxury sedan, followed by my mother's massive white SUV. Then my Aunt Cynthia and Uncle Mark in their ridiculous red convertible, a tacky monument to midlife crisis. Finally, Leo's roaring sports car, which he could only afford because my parents paid for it. "They're early, Mr. Davenport noted, trying to catch us off balance. The doorbell rang, sharp and demanding, followed by a loud knock. Mr. Davenport nodded to Vincent, who then opened the door. My father stood there, stunned for a second to see a stranger. Behind him, my family was clustered together, their faces a mix of rage and smug entitlement. "Where's Chloe?" my father demanded. "This is a private family matter." Vincent held his ground. "Miss Sterling is expecting you. Please, come in." My family pushed into the foyer, then stopped dead when they saw the small crowd waiting for them in the living room. I stood in the middle of the room with Mr. Davenport right behind me. "What is all this?" my mother shrieked, her voice tight with fury. "You've invited strangers into a private family affair?" Before I could respond, the front door opened one last time, and two more people walked in. The first was Judge Catherine Vance, a formidable woman in her 70s and a dear friend of my grandparents. She was followed by Sarah Lynn, a local journalist whose entire college tuition was paid for by my grandparents' foundation. My father S. face drained of all color when he saw Judge Miller. The judge had overseen a nasty corporate lawsuit years ago, one my father lost despite throwing his weight around. "Eleanor," he stammered, his voice a pathetic attempt at cheer. "What a surprise to see you here." The judge's face was unreadable, like granite. "I am here at the express written request of Henry and Clara Monroe, represented by their attorney, Mr. Davies. They asked me to serve as an impartial observer regarding their to prevent any family disagreements." My mother shot a glare at Sofia Martinez. "This is a private matter. We're here for heirlooms that belong to us." "Why is a reporter present?" Sophia offered a thin smile. I'm just a friend of the family, not here professionally, unless, of course, a crime were to happen. Then my duties would kick in. The threat hung in the air, sharp and clear. Right on cue, the side door opened. 6 people filed in, forming a quiet, protective arc behind me. They were the most loyal people from my grandparents' company, folks who knew my uncle since he was a boy and watched him become a man who never showed up. "You can't be serious," my cousin Ethan sneered. "You think this little welcome party is going to scare us?" I stepped forward, feeling stronger with them at my back. "I know why you're here. You think you're entitled to my grandparents' estate, no matter what the will says. You think you can just bully me into giving you what you want." My Uncle Mark's face hardened. Those old fools were losing their minds. "We're just here to fix their obvious error." From behind me, Dorothy Gable's voice cut through the tension. "Actually, Mark, we have records of every time you tried to get money from your parents for the last 2 decades. She flipped open a thick binder, including the loan from their retirement fund in 2016, the forged check from 2018, and your attempt to have Henry declared incompetent last year when he wouldn't fund Ethan's ridiculous startup." My uncle's face turned a sickly, chalky color. That's all completely out of context." Marcus stepped forward next, holding up a tablet. "I also have the documents for the company loan you conveniently forgot to pay back, Mark. $200,000 from 2012 for that beach house in Florida. Your parents never took legal action, but they could have." One after another, my grandparents' allies detailed my family's financial assaults, a stark contrast to how they were never there in person. My Aunt Carol, who had been silently raging, finally turned on me. "You ungrateful little monster. You twisted their minds against their own family." Judge Miller cleared her throat. "In fact, Mrs. Monroe, I've read Clara's personal journals. There was no outside influence. Your parents were exceptionally clear about their reasoning." "This is also theatrical," my mother said, waving a dismissive hand. "But it doesn't change anything. We will contest this will, and we will win, Mr." Davies stepped forward. "I've brought some documents for all of you." He handed a thick manila envelope to each of my relatives. "This is a file of evidence that become public record the second you file to contest the will. It contains bank records, text messages, emails, and even recordings of your conversations with Henry and Clara over the past decade. I would strongly advise you review its contents before making any legal decisions." My Uncle Mark, who had been silent, ripped his envelope open and began to read. His face turned even whiter with every line. After a minute, he placed a hand on my Aunt Carol's arm. "We need to go," he whispered. "This isn't a fight we can win." She furiously knocked his hand away. My brother is not a coward. But my uncle was frozen, just staring at the papers in his hands. It was a record of shady business deals he'd buried years ago, along with transcripts of awful things he'd said about his own parents when he thought he was safe. Sophia Martinez spoke up again. "I should also mention the estate is now under 24-hour video surveillance. Any attempt to remove property without permission will be treated as felony theft." Marcus nodded. "The new system records everything, inside and out. All footage is backed up securely off-site." While my family was absorbing that, I went to a small table and picked up papers Mr. Davies had ready. "These are cease and desist orders for the threats you've been making," I said, handing them right to Ethan. I gave the next set to my uncle. "This is a formal notice. I know what you took from the house after the funeral, and I want it all back." My mother started to object, but I just spoke right over her. "And these," I said, handing her the last stack, "are the conditions for any future relationship I'm willing to have with you. It starts with you honoring my grandparents' last wishes and ends any attempt to challenge their will." The room fell completely silent as my family finally understood. My grandparents hadn't just their legacy. They had blocked every single move my family could possibly make. The community they built stood right there with me. My uncle was first to speak. "This isn't over," he blustered, but his voice had zero conviction. "Actually, Mark, it is," Judge Miller corrected him. "Your parents were incredibly thorough. Any court would uphold their wishes based on the mountain of evidence they collected." One by one, my relatives started backing toward the door, their threats melting against a solid wall of truth. Ethan shot me a look of pure hatred as he passed. "This isn't the end," he hissed. "Maybe not," I replied, my voice perfectly steady. "But it is the end of you taking advantage of people. My grandparents saw exactly who you are. That's why we are all here." As they finally left, the tension in the room snapped. Dorothy immediately started pouring coffee and passing around pastries, trying to clear the air. Everyone was congratulating me, but I felt completely hollow, caught between inheriting a fortune and losing what was left of my family. I did what my grandparents asked, but I had to destroy my own family to do it. The victory felt empty. Judge Miller must have seen the conflict on my face. She rested a hand on my shoulder. "Your grandparents would be so proud, Ava. Not just that you won, but how you did it." Sophia added, "You're more like them than you realize. That's exactly why they trusted you with everything." Watching my family's cars drive away, I knew that chapter of my life was officially over. The family I was born with was gone, but in its place stood a community built on genuine respect. That was the real inheritance my grandparents left for me. It wasn't the family I was born into, but maybe it was the one I was always meant to find. The next 6 months were a blur of rebuilding and grieving. The first few weeks were a painful grind of legal paperwork, finance meetings, and knowing my family saw me as a price tag. They did eventually reach out, but only for money, which proved nothing had changed at all. With Liam and my grandparents' old team, I launched the Henry and Clara Monroe Education Fund, launching it with a $10 million endowment for local schools and kids in need. The foundation focused on art programs and trade skills, things my grandparents always felt were overlooked, and I went back to my job as a kindergarten teacher, which seemed to shock everyone who thought I'd just quit after inheriting the money. My classroom at Northwood Elementary became a showcase for what proper funding can do. I bought new books, tons of art supplies, and the tech our school budget could never cover. Every one of my students got a healthy snack each day and a new winter coat if they needed one. They were small things for me to give, but they meant the entire world to those kids. With Marcus as my guide, I started learning the ropes of running Monroe Enterprises. I never took an executive title, but made sure the company kept my grandparents' values, like their profit-sharing plan and solid retirement benefits. The business thrived, keeping over 100 people in our town securely employed. My grandparents' house, once so huge and empty, slowly began to feel like my home. I finally moved into the master bedroom, though it took months to not feel like an intruder. With help from Marcus, I converted the huge unused basement into a community space for foundation meetings and local art workshops. Dorothy still came to help around the house 3 times a week, absolutely refusing to retire no matter how much I insisted she'd earned it. My family tried a few more times to get back into my life, and their reasons were always painfully obvious. My father called when his latest venture failed, asking for a small loan. My mother called when she heard about my foundation, suddenly wanting a seat on the board. My cousin Ethan sent a text when his startup finally collapsed, hoping I'd bail him out. Aunt Carol even called before the holidays, suggesting families belong together, especially in a big, beautiful house perfect for parties. And every single time, I politely but firmly said no, reminding them of the rules I'd set. I told them I was open to a real relationship, but it had to be built on trust and respect, not on a financial transaction. Not one of them could meet that simple requirement. So instead, I built new traditions with the chosen family my grandparents gave me. Our weekly jam sessions became the main event, with a rotating cast of friends like Chloe, Ben, and David and his kids. We celebrated birthdays, we cheered each other on, and we showed up for each other. It wasn't the family I was born into, but it was one held together by true loyalty and unconditional support. On a clear spring morning, just like the day they passed, I visited my grandparents' graves for the first time. I placed their favorite flowers on the stone and sat on the bench, finally ready to have a talk I'd been putting off. I'm trying to do right by you, I said to the silence. The foundation is already making a difference. We've funded 3 trade school apprenticeships for local kids who otherwise couldn't afford it. Your old construction crew still tells stories about you. A soft wind rustled the trees and the air smelled like fresh-cut grass. My grandma loved this kind of day. The perfect weather for writing a new song. I wish you could hear this, I said. I still have so many questions for you about the business, about everyone. You quietly helped, but I'm piecing it together. A few weeks ago, I found your old file box. It was filled with paid-in-full receipts for people's medical bills, college tuition, and emergency home repairs. You did it all without a word, never wanting any of the credit for it. Thank you for trusting me, I whispered. I think I'm finally getting it. It was never really about the money. It was about a code of honor using what you have to build up your community, not just to get your name on a plaque. Sitting there, memories came flooding back, and the sadness started to feel more like gratitude. I remembered Grandpa walking me through a job site, explaining how every neighborhood has a heartbeat. I remembered Grandma teaching me my first chords on the guitar. They came to every single one of my open mic nights while my parents was away on business. The real inheritance wasn't a business portfolio. It was their blueprint for a good life. The very next week, I hosted the Foundation's first big event, a ceremony to award grants to 10 local community projects. Watching these passionate, amazing people give the resources to make their dreams a reality, I could feel my grandparents there in spirit. One of the recipients was a young woman named Isabella Rossi. She reminded me of myself years ago, full of big dreams but with an empty wallet. She was starting a network of urban gardens in poor neighborhoods. After the ceremony, Isabella came up to me, her eyes just shining. My parents came to this country with absolutely nothing, she told me. They cleaned offices just so I could get an education. No one in my family has ever started their own project before. This grant changes our entire story. My younger brother sees me, and now he knows it's possible for him too. In that single moment, everything snapped into place. I finally understood what my grandparents were really building. It wasn't an empire of properties. It was a legacy of hope. Their decency created ripples of change. The inheritance fight showed my family's true character, but it also revealed a whole community of good people who respected my grandparents' integrity, not just their bank balance. That was the true inheritance, worth more than any dollar amount. So I keep going. I still write at my music, I manage the foundation, and I'm slowly learning the family business. The money is a tool for building things, but it doesn't define me. I still live in my simple apartment, drive my old truck, and give free guitar lessons on the weekends instead of going on big shopping sprees. I think they'd be proud of that. They always said wealth is a responsibility, not a prize. And now I understand. What about you? Ever deal with family jealousy when it comes to money? I'd love to read your story in the comments. If this story connected with you, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing it with someone who might be at a crossroads. Just remember, a true family is built on love and support, not on what you can get from each other. Thanks for listening to my story. I hope it gives you the strength to trust your own instincts, no matter what comes your way.